Okay. Yeah. So last month we didn't do a redo because of the lack of recording, but that's okay. So last month we talked about paint and marks. And one of the things that we had discussed was talking about the feathers. Before we go much further, let's just be pretty clear. Our grandmas and grandpas did wear feathers, and they didn't wear feathers. So we'll find out what times in which they would wear feathers and what kind of feathers and what's the whole big deal about feathers and why today we seem to be confused about feathers. And it's not going to be something that we can quickly go through. There's a few more slides on this one than we had last month. I think only 2 or 3 more, but there's going to be a lot of reading because we have to look at the oral traditions to get a good idea of what feathers actually meant to our ancestors. So Linda's going to be turning the page again because I'm sitting here in the back of the ambulance again, hopefully for the last time. So we're ready for the next slide. So our objectives are going to be, first, take a quick little look at the oral traditions and see what they have to say about feathers. Then we'll look at some historical traditions, see what women did with feathers, the men, and then some unsavory influences that have kind of tainted our knowledge of feathers. So if everybody's ready, let's see if we can go ruffle a few feathers in doing this. Feathers, the possession, and especially the wearing of an eagle feather, was a sign of authority. The wearing of an eagle feather, as we will see here in a little bit, seemed to have changed at some point in the far distant past. The wearing of a feather was predominantly done only during times of council or ceremony. There isn't a lot of information that says that our men actually wore feathers predominantly throughout the days. The eagle, the turkey, and the raven were the predominant feathers of choice. And the wearing of a feather was always secondary to paint. Last month, we saw how important paint was, and paint was far more important than the wearing of a feather. Next slide. So before we can really jump into a lot of things, we need to take a look at what the ancestors said. The oral traditions give us a lot of insight. Sometimes it's difficult to understand what the oral traditions are saying. And especially with Barbeau, he kind of helps us out a little bit because he gave a lot of really valuable footnotes. And the oral tradition, the big turtle myth, gives us a little clue about eagle feathers. One of the notations that was made by Barbeau gives us an idea that eagle feathers, I'm going to read the quote here, the eagle's feathers are stated to have been considered as a most valuable head ornament among the ancient Wyandottes. And that is a quote from Mary McKee, and other informants also confirm that. So an important thing about that statement there is 2 things. It's a statement in past tense, and it says that the ancient Wyandottes, so a past tense going back a long time ago, would be the time frame, and how long ago that is, we don't know, where the eagle feather was actually worn by our ancestors. The oral tradition of the big turtle is talking about a feather that had been stolen from the eagle. The feather was stolen from a nephew of an old man. And when the old man found out that his nephew had stolen the feather from the eagle, his first statement was, "Danger, we are in danger." Because it was not something that humans were supposed to possess, and that was the feather of the eagle. The feather was eventually taken into possession by the big turtle with the help of the porcupine. And the big turtle's friends tried to get this feather back. Everybody wanted to possess the feather. And eventually the story comes to the conclusion that the big turtle was the one who kept the feather. And the feather being in the possession of the big turtle was a token of the big turtle's superiority within the nation, if you will. So the feather here in this big turtle myth is telling us is a sign of authority, and that is an eagle feather. The next myth that we want to look at, the oral tradition, next page, is the rabbit and the wolf. And we have another little clue in here about feathers. The rabbit and the wolf is a different type of an oral tradition because it was actually put together as kind of a little song, a little hymn. There is some singing involved, and then there's the telling of the story. And there is a quote that is made by the rabbit that is interesting. The rabbit said, "If my ears stand up together in that way, it is because in the old time, I used to stick eagle feathers on my head." Again, this oral tradition is showing us that the eagle feathers was used in the old time. And for some reason that we don't really know why, it kind of fell out of favor. But the tradition here, the rabbit and the wolf, basically starts with the wolf demanding that the rabbit do something. The rabbit was supposed to serve the wolf's needs. The rabbit basically declined and was very boastful toward the wolf in his accomplishments from the old days. And the old days, he used to wear a eagle feather. The rabbit was pretty boastful of that, and it ended up costing his life because the wolf wouldn't have anything to do with it and ended up eating the rabbit. So the moral of the story is don't boast in what you've accomplished in your past lives. It'll catch up with you and you'll probably be eaten by the wolf. So next slide. So the oral and historical traditions are pretty much featherless. There is not a lot in our oral traditions, and there's not a lot that was preserved in the historical traditions that speak of the feathers. Unlike last month when we spoke about the paint, there is a lot of historical tradition that expresses how important that paint was, but feathers don't get much attention. The reason is not quite understood why the feathers, the eagle feathers, kind of fell out of favor and was worn by a lot of the other Iroquois nations, a lot of the Algonquian nations, but it doesn't appear that our ancestors were overly enamored with wearing feathers. The oral traditions also don't speak that much of other feathers outside of the turkey, and also one that might be surprising to everybody, the raven feather was also very important. So next page. There is one historical account that's very important for us to look at, and it's John Wesley Powell's Wyandotte Government. Mr. Powell, he gives a pretty good description as to why the importance of the feather was used in the tribe. And I'm going to read this, and there's actually a couple of pieces here I'm going to read that gives us an insight as to why the feathers were used and for what purpose they were used. And one of the instances was when the women were installed as chancellors. When a woman is installed as chancellor, a feast is prepared by the clan to which she belongs. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it would take too long. But basically, it states that the woman was painted and she was dressed up in her finest attire. And then the woman had a chaplet of feathers that was placed on her head. That chaplet of feathers basically installed her into a position of authority that she was being placed into. So the feathers expressed her authority now as a chancellor of her clan. And does everybody know what a chaplet is? Everybody familiar with that term? Is anybody?
I'm not really. Could you describe it in a little detail, please? please?
A good way that we could describe the chaplet would be to go back to like the Greeks. Everybody is familiar with the olive branch that would have been worn by a lot of the athletes and people in authority. They had this little wreath, if you will, of olive branches that they wore in their hair. The chaplet would be similar to that, kind of a little crown that would have been worn by the clan mother and also her women during times of installment of somebody new into the clan, and also especially during formal ceremony and during times of council. So the chaplet was kind of a crown, if you will, of feathers that indicated positions of authority by those within the clans. And the men, on the next
I have
slide.
a question before you move on.
Okay.
It's written counselor, but you're saying chancellor.
Right. My apologies for not pronouncing it correctly.
Oh, so it's a mistake. Okay.
Yeah. The men, when the clan chiefs basically were phased out, they became the chancellors. The counselor, this is Powell's description of what he defined everybody as. So it's our clan mothers, along with the women, their leading women. That's who he's referencing here. He called them counselors, chancellors. The men were chancellors, the women were counselors.
Okay, because to me the two words have different meanings. So I
yes, they do.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, next slide. Okay, the clan chiefs, when they were installed, after they were chosen by the clan mother and her women, the men were also placed into their positions of authority with the chaplet of feathers. So they, along with the women, were the only ones that could have worn that chaplet of feathers, which designated them as being installed into those positions of authority. The feathers set them apart from the others within the clan. Along with that chaplet of feathers, something else is rather unique to the men. Here it says that an elaborately ornamented tunic was also given to the clan chief, which also separated him even further. It gave him that extra sense of authority within the clan. There was always a great amount of celebration that was done with the installment. And if you notice with the women, the men were also put in place by, as what is said here, the sachem of the tribe, the head chief of the tribe. And that would have been important because the clan chiefs were not only installed within their clan as the clan chiefs, but they were also installed into the tribal council. So the head chief of the tribe would have done the installation both at the clan level as well as the tribal level. Next slide. And another thing that was pointed out by Powell is their personal adornment, which we talked a little bit about this last month. And each clan had their own distinct way of painting the face. The chaplet was worn by the clan chief and the council of women, which would have also included the clan mother when they were inaugurated, and subsequently during the festivals, occasions, during council. So that would have, again, installed them into that position of authority to represent the clan as well as the tribe on the men's behalf in council. The paint was omnipresent. A clan citizen did not go anywhere without their paint, but the feathers were not, as I mentioned before, as important to have been worn on a daily basis. It would have not been uncommon for the common man to have not worn feathers throughout the days. So next slide. So as I pointed out, feathers were a sign of authority. They were not necessarily worn also during times of war. And we'll find out why we have this idea that all of the warriors wore feathers toward the end of the presentation here. So the eagle feather was supremely important, but rarely worn. Why, we don't know. The oral traditions doesn't really tell us what the circumstance was, but our ancestors eventually moved away from the eagle feather and they wore more turkey feathers than they did the raven. The raven, if any of the warriors would have worn a feather during war, it most likely would have been the raven, because the raven was pitch black. And the black feather would have been significant for the representation of being out for killing the enemy. It represented death to the enemy. So feathers were very ceremonial. And one of the things that I found interesting during my research is a lot of us are familiar with Roundhead. Roundhead was Tecumseh's war chief, if you will. He was also Tarhe's war pole. He was the war chief of the Wyandotte Nation. And Roundhead was known by William Walker Jr. William met him when he was a young man, and he thought very highly of Roundhead. And Roundhead has probably been underrated in history, because if it wasn't for Roundhead, Tecumseh could not have accomplished what he did during the War of 1812. Tecumseh was the face of the rebellion, if you will, but Roundhead was the mastermind of it. He was the military genius that allowed for Tecumseh to have success. And the authority that Roundhead had among the tribes that had aligned with Tecumseh and Great Britain would have been supreme. He had great authority within that alliance of nations. And William Walker Jr. made a notation in some of his notes that Roundhead would only wear a feather, and it was an eagle feather, during state occasions, as William noted, only during council. So when on the warpath, when on the battlefield, even to fight the British, the Americans, whomever he was fighting, Roundhead did not wear a feather during war. It was only during state occasions. So that kind of helps us with some misconceptions there on the wearing of feathers during war. Women didn't wear feathers. It would have only been the clan mother and her women that would have worn a feather. And that was only during their inauguration or during times of ceremony. So next slide. We also have some accounts where the daily wearing of feathers could have been taken within the community as a sign of vanity. There is one interesting little observation that was made by Reverend Finley, where he was talking about Samumdawat. Samumdawat was eventually killed in the Black Forest, the Black Swamp. His assassination was one of the reasons why they finally decided to go ahead and give up Ohio and Michigan lands to the Americans, because his assassination was horrific. Samumdawat was very important, but before he actually became converted to Christianity, Samumdawat was known for his vanity. And Reverend Finley made an interesting observation here about the way that Samumdawat presented himself that was not always taken well within the other citizens of the nation. Finley said, fond of his Indian dress, he, referring to Samumdawat, always made his appearance at these places more to attract the attention of others, bringing attention to himself, than to be instructed. His headdress was generally enormous, decorated with the plumes of almost all the birds of the forest and swelled to an enormous size. So it was frowned upon by a lot of the citizens for the men to have worn a headdress. In recent years, that headdress has been referred to as a Gastoa, which is actually the headdress of the Six Nations. So a lot of the men would have worn feathers. They would not have worn them daily, but it would have been rare because of that sense of vanity that they would have been presenting to the others within the nation to have worn a headdress on a daily basis. And Samumdawat, when he converted to Christianity, kind of paid the price for that. Because after he converted to Christianity, his headdress of all the birds of the forest was taken and tossed into a fire and burnt up, to kind of show that sense of pride, that vanity that he carried himself with that headdress was no longer important to him. So next slide. There has been, in recent years, a lot of questions as to what did the men look like? How did they dress? The feathers, everything that they were believed to have worn. And one of the best descriptions that I can find of our warriors was done by Reverend Finley again in History of the Wyandotte Mission. Reverend Finley had a lot of problems with Yonquat. Yonquat was the chief of the nation at that time, and he felt that he was losing a lot of his authority to Reverend Finley and to Christianity. So Yonquat was constantly challenging Reverend Finley, and he described here what Yonquat looked like whenever he would come and actually confront him. And the description is pretty detailed. And one of the things that I want to point out again, since we're talking about feathers, is the description of the feathers and the headdress is pretty marginal. It's not the focus of his description. The only thing that Finley said about the headdress was that it consisted of feathers and painted horsehair. And if we have an idea of what the headdress is now that our chiefs are wearing, it's kind of hard to see how horsehair would fit into a headdress of the warriors, of the leading chief of the nation. And when you get time, when we share these slides, read that description there if you haven't already done it. It's pretty impressive, the wow factor that our men had when they showed up for ceremony and things was pretty impressive. So next slide. Next slide. This is a headdress. No, go back to the headdress. This is a headdress that can be found up in Kansas City at the Wyandotte County Museum. And I had seen it several years ago when we were up there in Kansas City and just passing through the museum. They had it out on display. This is a Wyandotte headdress that most likely would represent what our headdress, if one was worn by the men, would have looked like back in the 17th, 18th centuries. And it's quite different from what we have been seeing here in recent years. So I wanted everybody to see this. If you have a chance to get up to Kansas City, go to the Wyandotte County Museum. And Maryland, you might see if they've still got it out on display. It's been several years since I've seen it. Hopefully they haven't taken it and put it in the archives. But this is a really cool representation of how the headdress most likely would have looked when one was worn by our men back in the days.
Hey,
okay, it's still out.
Yeah, Becca, was this still out or was it underneath when you were there and I was there with you?
It was still out.
Was it? I couldn't remember if it was under or not.
Yeah, it was still out. It's a great little museum to go to if you're in the Kansas City area.
They've got some treasures up there that we probably haven't even come to realize that they've got yet. So it'd be nice when we get an inventory of what they've got, because we'll probably be blown away with some of the things that they have. But if you're up in the area, stop in. This is a really nice exhibit, and to see this headdress, it's really nice to see. So next slide. Okay, can anybody tell me who these two men are? It's two of our chiefs. And the reason I put them in here is both of these men were very involved. They were determined, once we had moved from Kansas to Indian Territory that became Oklahoma, they were determined to try and reinstall the old clan way of government that had been lost when we left Ohio for Kansas. The chief on the left, that is Matthew Mud Eater. The chief on the right, that's Nicholas Cotter. And both of these men are very prominent chiefs within the nation. In my opinion, Chief Mud Eater is one of our most important chiefs in history, because it was through his action of leading the citizens who didn't sign or go with the acceptance of citizenship in 1855. It was Matthew Mud Eater that led that band of very few Wyandottes to Indian Territory in 1857. Matthew couldn't stay because he had actually accepted citizenship, but through his actions, it got us into Indian Territory, where we eventually called home. I put this in here to show that both of these men were in Washington, D.C. in 1877. About this same time, the United States government was starting to parade a lot of the nations into Washington, D.C. to show them how daunting and how powerful the United States was, and to also take pictures and have interviews and get a little bit of the traditions, and to preserve a little bit for science as to what the nations basically consisted of. Matthew and Nicholas went out there, and this is the time in which they actually sat and gave a lot of dialogue to Powell, which created Wyandotte government. And I put the pictures in here to show you that both of these men, when they went out there, they were representing the Wyandotte nation, and all the other nations were also representing their nations and their traditional regalia. One thing that you see that's missing with both of these very prominent chiefs at the time is they are not wearing feathers. By this time, by the late 1800s, feathers had predominantly been lost within the tribe. The only time that they would have been used would have been like during green corn and other ceremonies where they were displayed during ceremonial functions. So the next slide. Everybody will recognize the next chief, our Chief Bearskin. That is one of the most impressive pictures of him that Mr. Garcia had taken. And everybody has seen this picture. He's our chief. And notice his headdress. The headdress that he is wearing, and that a lot of our other men are wearing nowadays, is a replica of the headdress of the chiefs and the men wore in Wyandotte. The headdress that we are wearing today has become a new tradition of the nation, but it was not an original tradition. It is a tradition now that we would have a hard time trying to replace because everybody's familiar with it. It has been adopted. It is new tradition. But you can see with the old photo on the right there, that was taken right around 1899. That is the headdress of the Wyandotte people. So the next slide can kind of give us some ideas as to why a lot of our misconception on the wearing of feathers exists today. And the big one is Hollywood. The movies express a lot of the Indians wearing feathers, and most of the Indians in the Hollywood movies are what? They're from the Great Plains. They are the Sioux. They are the Lakota. They are the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, and all of the Plains Indians did wear a lot of feathers. So because the Plains Indians wear feathers in the movies, every other nation out there supposedly wears feathers as well. And that idea has been taken and absorbed by a lot of the historical artists. The painting that's there is one of my favorite by Robert Griffin, and it's entitled Killing Time. Most of the historical artists that are painting images such as this, they are using the images of the Shawnee people, not the Wyandotte, because there's very few paintings of what would be expressed as Wyandotte. We have a tendency to believe that what we see here is how our men looked. Maybe, maybe not. We just don't really know. We also have a lot of influences due to our lack of traditional knowledge and historical knowledge. And these borrowed traditions, like with the headdress that Chief Friend is wearing today, Chief Roll, it has become new tradition, even though it is borrowed tradition from the Wyandotte people. And another tradition that is also affecting our knowledge and use of feathers is the contemporary Pen Indianism, which can also be easily defined as the powwow. Has anybody ever been to a powwow when a feather has fallen from one of the dancers' regalia? The powwow comes to a stop. When that eagle feather touches the ground, it's a big deal. The powwow cannot proceed until that feather has been retrieved and given back to its rightful owner. And that owner is also, he's embarrassed or she's embarrassed when that feather touches the ground, because it's a big deal in today's tradition. So a lot of our men would have worn feathers, not necessarily on a daily basis. Feathers were more of a symbol of authority during time of council and during time of celebration. So hopefully that can kind of help us a little bit as to how feathers have affected our people and why we don't see a lot of feathers being used and worn today, because it's a part of our tradition, but it's not, especially with the eagle feather, something that we have pursued for a long, long time. Why? I hope to find out sometime what took place. And that's it. Any questions on that?
Woo, woo. Exactly. Just like the headbands that the feathers often go in with Hollywood Indians, that was started to keep the wigs on place on the actors. So
Yeah. And a lot of people, they just adopt what they see in Hollywood, not thinking about it, not looking to research their own traditional beliefs. And it just is so easy for a tradition like that to be installed within a nation, and nobody knows why.
exactly. Okay, any questions? Feel free to unmute and ask, or put it in the chat. Marilyn hopes someone else who needs to go will go first. We're gonna have you start then, Marilyn.
Okay, I will, you know me, one question leads to another. So back to the headdress that's here in Kansas City. The first time I saw it, I believe Chief Norman was there. Kim Garcia may have been there. I forgot who else. And at that time, it was thought that this may have been a headdress that was made up like, what's the one picture with the, is that Cotter that's in the, with the full headdress? So it was believed that maybe this was the same type of headdress, but now you're saying this was probably our original type headdress. Do you know why we may have went towards the Wendake and not have gone back to something like this?
Lack of knowledge. I can remember when we were discussing headdresses back with the culture committee many years ago. And many years ago, we just didn't know a lot. We didn't know hardly anything, actually. So we had to borrow a lot of traditions from other nations in order to give us something to actually believe. And when we were looking at the reinstate or the installment of the powwow, it was very important that when Wyandottes actually went to the powwow, that we would represent ourselves in a traditional kind of a way, but nobody knew how we could do that. We didn't know what our ancestors looked like. So I'm going to mention a name, but I'm not going to mention it in any derogatory way. or any way to make it sound demeaning. But Charles Bucer was a phenomenal researcher, and he was brought in to do a lot of research on the tribe, mainly to help the tribe with a lot of the grants and some funding that was going on with old treaties. And he also got enamored with our traditions and our history, and he fell in love with the tribe. So he just started doing just general research. And it was Charles Bucer that did a lot of research on how we looked, what did we dress, what did we eat, and things like that. And at that time, there was a big movement with this Wyandotte Wyandotte Association. So it was just an easy thing for Mr. Bucer to make an assumption that Wyandotte and Wyandotte were one and the same. So about that time is when we started looking at their headdress, because we didn't know of a headdress that we had. There's a couple of other samples of headdresses that were taken by Barbeau back to Canada in 1911, 1912 that show some similarities to this, but it's also showing a little bit of Seneca influence as well that looks more like the Haudenosaunee. But this is the only headdress that I know of in existence that probably expresses a little bit more as to the uniqueness of who we are as Wyandottes. And we just didn't know about it back in the 1990s when we started digging out a lot of this information. So lack of knowledge. And because we needed to grip something and call it ours, is how the headdress of Wyandotte was adopted and has now become tradition.
Now, the librarian in me needs to speak up here. Just to remind people, we are so spoiled by Google. We are so spoiled by the fact that we have the internet to link so much information for us that you have to stop, especially those of us who are a little older, you have to stop and remember what it was like to use a card catalog. And if something was misfiled or was filed under another spelling, there wasn't always a record linking it. And so when Mr. Bucer was doing so much of his research, he was ferreting out all this information, but he had nothing to help him see if he had found all the sources that were out there. Plus, the Library of Congress kind of lumps us all together. So there's no distinction between who went to Quebec to Wyandotte and who went to what's now the Michigan area and who finally ended up in Indian Territory. They lump it all together, which makes it really hard to filter the sources as to who they're really talking about. And we still encounter that today. So
Yeah,
librarian lecture over.
the name Huron represents Wyandotte, and it represents Michigan, Ohio, Kansas, and Oklahoma. It represents us. And that silly name Huron had caused so many problems for men such as Mr. Bucer. There was no distinction, there was no differentiation, if you will, between the Canadian Wyandottes and the American Wyandottes, which were eventually at some point Canadian as well. So that has been a big problem that a lot of the early researchers had to dig through. As I've done a lot of my research, Mr. Bucer's initial collection was very helpful. And he gave me a lot of insights to start looking into certain areas. But the one thing that is most helpful is the internet. A lot of information that I have found has been one sentence, one phrase, one little paragraph buried inside of a volume of 800 pages that references something unique to the Wyandotte people. And without the power of the search engines, without Google, archive.org, we wouldn't have near the knowledge that we do today. And a lot of what I have, we're only scratching the surface, guys. There's a lot more, and because of time, we're trying to distill it down into some really good digestible nuggets, but there's so much more out there. It is phenomenal how much was written about the Wyandotte people, but it's so difficult to find it.
Mhm.
I believe, and I say on the back of a turtle, that the United States government was very embarrassed at the time of the Revolutionary War. When they won independence from Great Britain, but they were still being defeated on the borderline of the Ohio River by those silly Indians in Ohio country. They won one war, but they were being defeated in a second war. And the leader of that Indian alliance was the Wyandotte people. And I believe that the United States government did this big smear campaign, if you will, so that a lot of our accomplishments as a nation was given credit to the Shawnee people. So as you read in these books, you need to be able to understand history and what took place and realize the Shawnee didn't do that. We did. They replaced our name with the Shawnee name. So you have to be able to understand how history played out during the border wars too. So there's a lot of stuff out there.
Lots
Headdresses
and
like
lots of
this
good stuff.
are rare to find.
Mhm. Okay, any other questions, everyone?
Any more questions or comments? Well, that one went just a little bit longer than we hoped. It kind of started a little bit later too. So is everybody enjoying all this?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure that everybody is enjoying and is getting something out of this, because this is so important for us. And it's little things like this that a lot of people are confused about. And I want to make sure that what we do with these presentations are something that everybody is enjoying and learning from. That's paramountly important.
It's very much the case.
I have one other question, thoughts. Okay, if we did not wear feathers except for ceremony and so forth, and our headdresses have changed, in today's times, it would be okay for women to wear feathers because it could be a new tradition. Would that be correct?
In order for, I'm not against William Elsley Connolly, because he did a lot of stuff for us, but he also did a lot of bad stuff for us. Mr. Connolly preserved a lot of very valuable information, but he also gave us a lot of very worthless information too. But he did make a comment that made perfect sense about our traditions. As the ancient traditions become into existence, we don't know when they all started up. They just happened somehow. All these traditions were developed over time, could be hundreds, thousands of years, we don't know. But once a tradition was put into place, that tradition didn't change. It took great effort for a tradition within the clans to change. There had to have been something dramatic happen that would have necessitated that a tradition be altered or changed for whatever reason. And whenever a tradition was changed, it would have been a painstaking event within the clans that would have affected the whole of the tribe. So for us to just say, we're going to start wearing feathers is not a good reason for us to start wearing feathers. There has to be some justifiable reason. There has to be something that we can identify in past tradition, or there has to be a dire need in future tradition for us to start doing something like that. When the tradition of the headdress was adopted into the tribe, we knew nothing. We didn't know better. It was a mistake to have done that, but it has been now a well-received mistake. So tradition can be brought into the tribe through somebody's error, and we can find out later that that error is wrong tradition, but it has been adopted and it can't be changed now. Same thing with the willow branches on our turtle. Willow branches have no traditional meaning for our nation, none. It was a mistake that was brought in and adopted, and now it's hard to get rid of it because it is adopted tradition. So for women just to start wearing feathers, if the women want to do that, they need to find justifiable reason for future tradition and the women in future times to say that they now will wear a feather. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but for powwow, people that are dressed are out dancing for powwow a contest, they would fall under powwow.
Powwow tradition, right. And that's one of the things that I pointed out in the previous slide to this last one, is we do have tradition now that is being altered, being created within the nation because of this Pen Indianism, which is the powwow tradition. That tradition of powwow is basically creating Wyandotte tradition for future generations.
Mhm.
So through that tradition of powwow, that could be the means in which the feathers could be worn by the women during times of ceremony, like they would have been done by the clan mothers and leading women in times past. So through that new tradition of powwow, that could be the portal in which new tradition can be brought into the nation.
Another Pan-Indian tradition that is being adopted is the eagle feather for graduates. And some graduates are wearing it on their cap at graduation, and some are just holding it. So that's another context in which feathers are being used and being brought in. So
And today, an eagle feather is a good, if you will, legal, because not everybody can possess an eagle feather. Only a American Indian can, that is a citizen of a federally recognized tribe.
right.
So that eagle feather is representative during those type of occasions that they are a citizen of the Wyandotte Nation, which that speaks volumes to all the other people that see them walking down the aisle and getting that diploma. It gives that, it just gives me chills thinking about it. It just shows that they're Wyandotte. They are a
Yeah.
citizen of the nation.
And that's common for something that has such powerful symbolism, shows why it gets adopted so readily, is because it does tie into something very emotional, very connected to our sense of being Wyandotte.
And hundreds of years ago, there would have been a lot of differences between all the nations. The Iroquois people were all the same, but totally different. The differences between the Iroquois and the Algonquian people were even more different, but there was a lot of similarities. A lot of these nations had a lot of common beliefs. They shared a lot of common ideas, and they adopted traditions across the tribes. They were closer back then than what we can realize today. And with the internet, with the way in which we can socialize during powwow and other means, a lot of these traditions are being shared across the nations, and we are adopting those into the tribe through that Pen Indianism, and it is becoming new Wyandotte tradition. And some people question that. Other people are just readily accepting of it. But that is how traditions are made that can come into the nation through alternate sources and alternate influences that don't directly relate to us. There's a lot of things that we do and a lot of things that we have that's our traditions that are Shawnee, it's Seneca Cayuga, it's Wendake. And being able to identify that over time becomes more and more difficult because it is now Wyandotte tradition.
Another would be ribbon skirts.
Ribbon skirts.
Contemporary Native fashion.
Mhm.
Yeah, that has no traditional relevance to the women in the 17th or 18th centuries. But it is now tradition.
Yep.
Because the women got together, they with your help, Marilyn, designed that look of the ribbon dress, and it has been adopted, and it is tradition.
Okay, folks, we're at about 8:30 now. Any other final questions or comments anyone would like to share?
One other comment that might be something good to have put in the Turtle Talk on the website is getting the card to have the feathers, to possess an eagle feather.
Well, I have feathers. A lot of us have feathers. As we become more knowledgeable as to what the eagle feather represents, not only with contemporary tradition, but also ancient tradition. I kind of support a little bit of what Mr. Culver does when he starts talking about the eagle feathers. I don't know if it's something that we should just spread across the nation far and wide. If people have an interest in it, we can help them, but I don't think we need to promote it on the website that everybody go and get their eagle feathers. Because to possess an eagle feather, you got to have respect for the feather. You have to understand what the feather is for, and to flaunt it, as some people would do, would be disrespectful to the eagle and the feather.
I guess I didn't come across the way I needed it. Like with the thing of giving eagle feathers when a student graduates. If somebody is given a feather when somebody dies, you still should have that card, or something that says this was given to that person by someone who was card carrying. That's the thing I'm trying to get across, that you just can't go out and get the feather, or if you were given one, you still need some piece of paper that says you have the right to have that feather. That's the part I'm trying to get.
Yeah.
Not that everybody go out and get feathers, but.
And most people I know who do that also do a follow-up with making sure that everyone has the right paperwork. Yeah. It's a good point to keep in mind. All right, any other questions? Bert, you got any questions?
No questions. I just had a comment about the graduation. My nephew's daughter graduated from college, and she had the sash, which I think that's a great thing. That's a wonderful thing with the tribal sash. Without a feather, that still is a strong representation of the tribe and the belonging.
I agree. And that's one reason why the education department came up with that, is it's a way for people to represent and be very visible. And those of us who had already graduated were incredibly jealous when they came out, because it is a very cool thing.
As a professor, I went through every graduation. I would have been delighted to wear that sash.
Exactly. Okay, folks. How are we doing?
Kishabe. Une.
All righty, I am going to.
Any suggestions for next month?
No suggestions yet. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop
I have one.
recording.
I have one.